So we are recording,
Excellent.
and so go right ahead.
Okay. Hello. Welcome to everybody. Those of you who are coming back, those of you who are here for the first time. Uh, this week, as I mentioned in the little teaser that I threw out, we're going to be talking about art and uh, politics and protests and really the power of art to send messages, and in some cases political messages. And there's a particular document that I posted, which I just realized sitting here that I forgot to print out for myself, but luckily I know it, that talks about this a little bit in the past, which is where we're going to start today, and then I'll pivot to the present. But before I begin, I'll turn things over to Matt, my partner in crime, who will offer the logistics about the best way to ask questions after I'm done with the first half of our discussion here, and we open things up to you.
Yes, thank you, Joanne. So folks, if this is your first time, I know for a lot of you it's not, you've heard this before. Excuse me, but if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section on the below. I think folks are getting familiar with Zoom, but if you go to the bottom of the page, you'll see a Q&A button. Go ahead and click on that and put in your questions there. You can put them in anytime, but we'll wait till we're done with Joanne talking, and then before we answer them. We do have chat open. We do like to hear where you're from and any comments that are, of course, germane to the conversation in some way, shape, or form, and family friendly can go into Zoom chat. And my weekly plug for the National Council for History Education brings this to you. And if you like this kind of programming and you like our programming, please consider joining us, www.nche.net, or follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter tag is @historyed, and we really would appreciate getting to know you and getting to serve you and doing more of this fine programming. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Joanne. I'm going to hide and come back in a little while for the conversation part.
Okay, excellent. Again, welcome to everybody. So I want to talk about art, and I've chosen early America to begin with, partly because obviously it was a moment of revolution, it was a moment of transition, it was a moment of potentially great change. It was a moment when art forms were being created and people were thinking about things like national identity and what the nation stood for. It's not the only such time in American history, but it is a significant one. And what's interesting about the American example is, of course, with the revolution, suddenly these British colonists were Americans. They hopefully wanted their own culture. They were very much, or had been very much, attached to England and France as cultural centers. And now suddenly they're on their own and they're thinking about art and what it can do and what kinds of messages it sends. It's not really surprising that in the 1780s, you begin to see the first real burst of demand for American portraits, for works of American art, commemorating different Americans, commemorating war scenes. I think the first map that was printed in the United States comes out, I think in 1784, printed in the United States, and it has all kinds of American iconography on it, you know, liberty and all of these sort of other figures. So it's a moment when people are really thinking about this sort of thing. In particular, portraits had a real power. There was a real awareness on the part of Americans that, and some of them even put it this bluntly, that suddenly there were Americans who were on the world stage, and that hadn't really existed before. That the United States itself existed and was on the world stage, but people in particular, they were kind of amazed at the idea that there were American figures of historical importance that were explicitly America and had been fighting to create what was the United States. One of the people, and I should say before I launch into Charles Wilson Peale and his museum, I've always found this really intriguing. So before this point, the 1780s, Americans who wanted to be painters pretty much migrated to Europe, to England. That's where all the great masters of painting were. That's where you got educated, you kind of got credentialed, and then you potentially came back with that great European credential. Because of this demand in the 1780s for things that were American, in particular American portraits, suddenly what you had was Europeans migrating over to the United States to be where the demand was. So it's a really interesting moment. Now I want to go to Charles Wilson Peale. So Peale created, and I believe in the, I'm not even going to guess because I'm going to get the year wrong, created what he considered to be an American museum in Philadelphia. And he, in calling it an American museum, he thought broadly. So, you know, it had things from nature. It had mammoth bones that were found sort of out and about. It had any number of different sort of natural components that represented, you know, the United States as a place, but it also had a wall of 30 or so portraits of great Americans. And it included, you know, Jefferson and Adams and great generals, some diplomats. Thomas Paine, I believe, was up there. And some of you probably have seen some of these portraits. They tend to, people are kind of in a, I think people call them portholes. Some of these portraits, as a matter of fact, Independence Hall, I think, has some of them. I've seen some of them, and some of them I've even used in things that I've published. Anyway, so the document that I used today that relates to this is something that I found when I was working on my dissertation. So, you know, we're talking a long time ago, probably, I don't know, 90, see, 2, 3, 4, I don't know. And it stayed with me. And the reason it stayed with me is it represents something unusual. And that is someone who walked through, in this case, Peale's museum, and then wrote in a letter what it meant to him to walk through it. Wrote to his, in this case, to his wife. His name is Theodore Sedgwick, Massachusetts congressman. He kind of goes on a cultural tour of Philadelphia. He visits, and I think I included this in the passage that I posted. He visits a new lending library. He's like, well, there aren't a lot of books there yet. Kind of has to grow into itself, but it represents ambition of culture. And then he goes into Peale's museum, and I brilliantly forgot to print the letter out, but what it basically says, and you can see it, is that he was struck by the fact that there were all of these portraits of important Americans, and that it had never occurred to him that there were that many. Seeing them up on the wall like that had an impact on him. And I think he concludes with a line something like, you know, I'd never fully understand the power of portraits. But what grabbed me about that, well, partly what grabbed me is, as a historian, I'm always really interested in trying to understand people's perceptions of things at the moment that they're in, as best I can. No, we can't do that 100%. But in this case, luckily, he put it down on paper. I have to say, letters to wives are amazing resources that are often full of insights and confessions that these, you know, elite white men will confess to wives and nobody else. So this is an example of that. He says, wow, you know, it really moved me, the portraiture, the power of it. That stuck with me because it captures, in a personal standpoint, you know, from a personal point of view, very much that moment of people wanting to have art, wanting to have portraits, wanting to have things to create, to project an image of America for Americans and on the world stage. Jonathan Trumbull, you know, who is responsible for all of these sort of iconic images of, you know, the signing of the Declaration, all of these images that we associate with the founding period, he very much was doing the same thing. There's a quote that I don't have the precise quote written down here, but at one point he says he wants to tell the history of America in his own language, meaning by painting. And what's important there to note is he's not saying I am depicting grand scenes. He's acknowledging, he's telling the history of the United States, and what that means is, and as we all know, as savvy history consumers, the people who tell the history bring themselves to the telling, right? So he is expressing things that he is thinking, or things that he wants others to think in creating his art. And one of the things he's expressing, and you see it particularly in his battle scenes, he was very, very intent on showing that American soldiers during the Revolution were just as virtuous and just as noble and just as admirable as the British, right? The British are this prime example of everything. Trumbull is saying, oh, you can't assume that we're not that too. And you'll see often paintings where there's a British soldier attempting to do something not quite on the up and up, and someone holding him back and some American fending it off. There are moments, sort of exemplar moments, that represent Americans doing virtuous things. So he's sending out a message. And I did find in preparation for today an Abigail Adams quote, which is going to sort of segue into the second point that I want to make. So Abigail Adams, goes to look at some Trumbull paintings. And in particular, she sees some of the battlefield paintings and talks about, in very grand language, my blood froze, that it really had an impact on her. But the sentence or two that I wanted to quote is the impact that it had, or her understanding of what the paintings were doing. And you'll hear, she uses the word teaching. She says, Trumbull teaches mankind that it is not rank or titles, but character alone, which interests posterity. That's really interesting, right? She sees the portrait, she's affected by the grand drama of the battlefield, but then she says, no, I understand exactly what's going on in that painting. It's showing the character of Americans and how the character of Americans deserves to be appreciated. Now, that leads to my next point, and it's one that I've always found really interesting, and that will hopefully segue gracefully into my final point. But because Americans were so aware, number one, that they didn't have a grand tradition of American art, and number two, that they were kind of constructing an American culture, they thought a lot about how they would portray themselves, the elite leaders, beyond just little portraits, right? Statues, we're in the realm of talking about statues. They thought about statues, they thought about sort of grand, big, life-size portraits. And I couldn't find for today the precise quote, but what I have used in the past when I've lectured about this is the fact that they were very concerned that the life portraits, that the statues should be precisely life-size. Because if they were bigger than life, they were suggesting that these leaders were bigger than life, and that's not what they wanted to suggest. They did not want to seem monarchical. They did not want to seem to be suggesting that there was some aristocracy that was bigger and grander than everybody else. And they thought of that down to the level of wanting paintings and sculpture to be precisely life-size. And there's a John Adams letter I haven't seen in a while, but what I remember about it is he was very concerned about the measurement of his arms. I mean, like literally the inches, how many, so that it could be the right size to be life size and not bigger than life. So the larger point here is, think about, in all of these ways, the power that people assumed at the time that art had, and the power that it did have, right? The fact that something that seems like a plain work of art, a portrait, what seems more static than that, and that people in the period understood that there were messages being sent with that. They were even trying to send particular messages with that were of the moment, that had political significance, that were interpreting the revolution and what national identity was for the nation and for the world. That in all of these ways, art was kind of like Trumbull said about, telling the history of America in his own language. Art was part of a conversation, and it was a conversation of what America was, and how it fit into the world, and what it was going to at least publicly claim its values were. Now, the graceful segue. The reason I chose this week is partly because with all of the protests going on, with some of the, signs for sure, but outdoor art, paintings on buildings, the fence around the White House, there have been all of these moments of really dramatic images, some of them portraits, for example, of George Floyd, but any number of other images too, that are very much of this moment and communicating messages, right? And I think if you take the long view and think about different ways in which artwork in the semi-recent past has sent messages today, political cartoons, right? We've seen how political cartoons, I don't remember how many years ago it was that there was a cartoon, I think, of the Prophet Muhammad, and I want to say that there was a shooting about it and there was a grand uproar, and it was a cartoon, right? It was a work of art that had that kind of an impact for some of the people looking at that cartoon. Um, I've been thinking a lot about one of the problems of the present day moment, which is particularly related to the coronavirus. We see constantly a lot of attempts to express the size of this, the vastness of this, and people keep turning to numbers, right? Well, it's equal to the city of this, well, it's however many 9/11s. I mean, people keep trying to have numbers that somehow are going to capture the vastness of it. And numbers, sometimes like words, can't quite capture that. And what keeps coming back to mind for me is the AIDS quilt, right? The AIDS quilt, this huge quilt with one square representing a person who died of AIDS. People didn't need to see what the square said to get the message of that quilt. And it communicated vastness and numbers in a way that I think numbers themselves can't do. Just like I think words sometimes can't communicate the intensity and the sort of gut level value of some of the messages being sent by works of art. I think that the walls around the fence around the White House is a particularly interesting example of this. And that's obviously that idea of the public taking over a space and kind of making it theirs and posting things on it, particularly a space where conflict has happened or where there's been a tragedy, or in this case where it feels as though rights are being violated in some way. It's a fascinating phenomenon that people take that as a space for art, and not just with their own independent postings, but because they're doing it as a group, there's the power of collectivity, right? There's the power of the fact that you can walk a long distance and see message after message after message, and the messages themselves are important, but the fact that there are so many of them really suggests that there's a collective sense of something happening, that people are, in a sense, joined together at this moment. That's a hard thing to communicate. And sometimes I think art does that, and I think that fence in particular does that really well. I also think, thinking about paintings on the sides of buildings, thinking about any number of other forms of public art that we've seen, some of those messages are very specific and obvious. Some of them use, American icons to make a point, faces to make a point, images with a tradition to take those echoes and make a point. But in some ways, that's also a way of saying that the people painting those works of art will not be silenced, will voice what they want to say, and they will voice it how they feel the need to voice it. So in other words, they won't wait to be invited into a formal space. They have something to say and they want the world to say it. They want to say it to the world, forgive me. And they will not be silenced. They will express what they're thinking. They're voicing their concerns, and in doing that, in one way or another, by appealing to one or different audiences, are offering the possibility of a collective moment. So I guess part of what I'm saying here is art, we all know that art has kind of a deep emotional value during a moment of turmoil like the present. That kind of value carries a special power because we're in a moment of change. We're thinking about possibilities. We're thinking about impossibilities. We're thinking about everyone in different ways, what this nation might be able to be that it hasn't been before. And art is a way of triggering a willingness to think along those lines, right? It touches you in a way, and I say this as a wordsmith, right? That even words, I think, can't quite touch you because of social media. An image that's painted on the side of a building or in a sign, obviously, can become international in a very short amount of time. So that expands the power of these forms of art. The last thing I'll say before I open things up for question, because I do this every week. So every week I try to end with, I don't want to say a directive, I would say with suggestions about how to think about something that's in front of us now, using some of the discussion about the past that we start these discussions with. In this case, I would ask you to be aware when you're looking at artworks, at any form of art that's being put up, as activism or as protest, which art can very much be. Think to yourself, what is the message that the person painting it or creating it means to express? Think about what you're taking away from it. Think about what different audiences might take away from it. Some artwork might be intended for one audience or another, but some artwork is white people, black people, people of color are going to interpret in this moment some of this artwork in a very different way. That's worth thinking about, because then when you're thinking on that level, you're thinking about messages of art. You're thinking more broadly than you're thinking about a collective moment and what it means to other people, all of the other people included in that moment, and sort of how you fit in. So so many other weeks, I guess, I've in one way or another been preaching awareness of things around us. And in this case, I'm asking you to be aware of things that seem kind of cut and dry, right? A painting of a fist on the side of a building. Okay, well, why is it there? What does it suggest? Who put it up there? Do we know? What might it mean to different people? And what does that tell us about the moment that we're in and the ways in which different groups of people are going to need to corral their feelings and cooperate in different ways to work together, to do something together? Art, I think, does all of these things. This also now sounds like a plea for the study of the humanities, and it is. I think it's easy to brush aside the very sorts of things that I've been speaking about this morning as soft and unimportant. You know, this is the most obvious thing in the world to say, but the humanities are about humanity, right? The spirit of humanity, the essence of humanity, the process of being human, and how we engage with that and how we think about that and how we process that and how it works. So I will stop. I will not go on and start speaking about the humanities, which I feel very strongly about. But I will step back now and open things up so that you guys can ask questions. Oh, I do this every week. I say, now it's time for questions, and I forget the mug. For those of you who are new, every week I try to use a mug that is thematically related to whatever it is I'm talking about. Sometimes it's more of a stretch than others. However, it's a work of art on a mug. In this case, I would say the meaning of this is very much elite control. Elite control over horses and nature. So I think the message here, this is clearly something painted by elites, expressing how they want their world to be. And I believe it's the only mug that I have that has artwork on it. So here I am. Okay, now I will shut up and turn things over to Matt, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, thank you. That's wonderful. All right. So folks, we have one question in, and you know the drill. If we run out of questions, Joanne is stuck listening to my questions, which are always much less interesting. So the first one comes from Tim, who asks, given the recent wave to take down Confederate statues, what are some moments in American history in which statues were toppled as an artistic form of protest?
Well, of course, as an early Americanist, I go right back to an original one, and that is the toppling of the statue of King George III in Lower Manhattan, right? Iconic moment. July of 1776, New Yorkers pull it down, right? As an expression of protest, as an expression of that moment, as an expression of independence. that's powerful. And then can't remember where I was discussing this yesterday, but I was. Oh, I know. I was discussing it in a program that will be online at some point soon. What we were talking about was the empty pedestal was left there for a long time. And the empty pedestal was a powerful statement all by itself, right? The fact that not just that the statue had been taken down, but that now you could see that absence existing in that space. So, you know, taking down statues is an act of power. What's important to realize about the statues is that they represent the history of the people who put them up, right? They're in and of themselves. They are not necessarily telling us about the grand history of America. They might be, but the most significant thing about them is who put them up and why. Putting up a statue is a kind of declaration of some kind, whether it's ownership, whether it's inclusiveness or exclusiveness. Some of the statues that are being taken down tell you more about the people who put them up than they do about history, generally speaking. So I think it's worth considering what history is being talked about when we talk about these statues. And, you know, I think saying that history is being destroyed by taking them down, I think I would not go that far. I think history does not exist only in those statues. I think history exists in books, history exists in museums, history exists in teaching, history exists all over the place. Those statues are someone from a moment in time expressing their view of history. And that's a significant thing. But I think that the idea that by pulling some of these things down, we're erasing history, I wouldn't go that far.
Excellent. Um, okay, so I'm going to skip around a little bit just to kind of stick to what we in the areas that we're already talking about. Francesca, again, welcome. Good to see you. Asks, can you say anything about the folk art, if any, being created around the time of the American Revolution?
I don't know if I have specific things to say about it. I mean, I will say that American art, precisely because there weren't a lot, there was a limited number of artists who had formal training in these early years of the nation, that I think more things were considered art and were accepted that way than might have been in a country with a longer standing tradition of what art is. I think that acts on behalf of folk art. I don't think, I mean, I think folk art happens no matter what, right? I think that's just another way of expressing things. I have not done a personal study of folk art from the founding period of the revolution, but it would be fascinating to do, then I'm sure others have, because you would get a sense of potentially not what elite white guys in power are saying, but what others are saying and seeing and thinking. So again, a form of communication, a form of conversation that's meant to communicate something at the time and that still communicates something today.
Absolutely. Emily asks, as a nod to last week, one of the things that women fight against during the suffrage movement is the idealized women's form. Do you know do you know early on, did artists use women to represent ideals of America?
Yes. And I say that with built-in hesitation. They did, but in very specific ways that sort of matched the time. So for example, there's a famous image, a sort of cartoon of sorts, of tea being poured down the throat of a figure that represents liberty, is dressed as a Native American. Very often liberty, or the sort of the nation, is represented in one way or another as a woman. I don't think that's an attempt to give women power. I think that's a way of touching on, at the time, what would have seemed to be virtue and morality, and a thing that shouldn't be violated, and a thing that, you know, all of the cliches, in a sense, that go along with how people in the past might have conceived of women are somehow attached to that. So yeah, the female form was used in that way. It was used in that way in person. One of the things that I've always found really interesting about people's responses to social events, I began to find at one point people remarking on how grand a party was or wasn't, partly by judging what the women looked like. How many women were present and how grand was their clothing and how much jewelry did they have on? And somehow that was the way to measure the status and importance of an event, which I thought was fascinating. That's and they're literally using it as measurement. It was a grand evening. There were 30 women and they were dressed quite fine. They're using the female form to represent status in a way. Again, a really, really good question, interesting topic that also obviously over time is like beyond things that you can say about this. But that's also an indication at any given moment of men and the female figure, and then obviously how women plug into that conversation themselves by expressing themselves in art.
Mm-hmm. James asks, what were the founding fathers' ideas about being represented in national portraiture and statues as national symbols?
How did they feel about being national symbols?
About being represented in portraitures and statues as national symbols.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of what they were kind of taking for granted when they were worried that, like, John Adams wanted his arm to be the right length. They're partly assuming that people will look at that portrait and immediately connect it with American values, American morality, big, broad American themes. So in worrying about something goofy like the length of his arms, Adams is telling you he's assuming that people are going to be thinking about art in that way. Now, I think when you take a step back, the founding generation of elite folk, some of them had a mixed feelings about the fact that they kind of were becoming founder-ish people. And they were treated that way. John Adams is, in a sense, one of the more interesting people on this front, because people are beginning to, in his old age, he lives to be quite old, till 1826, people begin writing to him and asking him questions, and particularly young people. And their assumption is always, well, you were, the founders, and you were, how did you think of this grand thing? What kind of people were you? You're so much better than us. And Adams's message again and again and again was, no, we're not any better. We're really not any better. He talks about mistakes. I think I might have mentioned this on another episode. There's of History Matters. He talks about sitting and watching people sign the Declaration of Independence and seeing on people's faces that a lot of people were not happy about signing. He makes the point over and over and over again that yes, people are taking them to be sort of iconic representatives of a perfect founding moment. And he's saying over and over again, there was no perfect founding moment. We are not perfect people. And yeah, we are leaders, and that matters to us, and they worry about their reputation because of that. They're personally invested in the founding. But already at that early point, 1820, they're wrestling with the fact that people are trying to make them into symbols that they don't necessarily want to be. I will say, while Matt is coming up with the next question, just in glancing at the side, I can see all kinds of great suggestions about resources. One thing I will say, and some of you have already indicated this along the side, one of the remarkable things about the last 2 decades is the amount of art that is online, accessible, open, and in many cases free to use. My first book, I had to, hunt down pieces of art. I had to pay to use it. I had to sometimes have people take photographs of the art so that I could have the image. I mean, it was a whole process. And in this case, my most recent book 2 years ago, I just went online. A lot of it was free. Some of it wasn't free, but it was very easy to find by just searching around online. That means that there's a lot of stuff that's out there. Um, the problem with that, of course, then is the problem of databases, which is finding the thing that's useful to you.
Mhm.
Um, I'm gonna, Matt, if you will remind me, there's a book that I remember using 1,000 years ago that was put out by the Library of Congress that is out of print, but I believe parts of it are available online. And what the Library of Congress did was go through its collections and collect together images of the revolution, images of battles, images of people, images of generals, images of whatever. The hanging of John Andre, how did people represent it? It was just a big collection of revolutionary images. And just the fact that they were collected all together, um, that was a fine and handy thing. Um, I don't believe I have a copy of it because I think I've only ever seen it once at the Library of Congress, but I did manage to find somewhere online parts of it that are up. I hope they're still there. Matt will remind me,
Mhm.
but that's a handy starting point as well.
Excellent. And then just on that note, I put in a link to the National Folk Art Museum since there was a question about folk art.
Oh, I see that. Yeah, yeah.
And
There's so much
they
online.
some they have some amazing stuff that is folk art based, and that it has sort of a different um, text and tenure to it. So um, let's see. So actually, let's transition to a pedagogical question, which is I think a really good one. Laura asks, "What are some good questions in addition to audience and intent that we can use with our students as they examine art from a historian's perspective?"
Sure. One thing I would say, and this is, I know I've said this in the past about teaching with documents, and particularly documents from a time period where the language is a little bit alien. Um, I'm always talking about connecting with the feeling of something as a way to open a conversation. I think particularly with art or with political cartoons, it's a pedagogically almost necessary question, but it's a perfect opening question, which is, what does this make you feel? Because that doesn't require additional knowledge. There isn't, in a sense, a wrong or right answer. There will be answers, obviously, that touch on what you want them to touch on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I always find in teaching that those kinds of questions open up a conversation because I think students immediately realize there kind of isn't a wrong answer. So with artwork in particular, I think that's a great opening. And then you can talk about maybe what it was designed to make people think or feel, which then could put students back into that moment. It's also interesting. You can't do this in any kind of systematic way. It might be possible if you looked in some of the like museum catalogs of like Trumbull or Peel, if you can find comments by people looking at that art at the time, right? Experiencing the art, other people experiencing the art and thinking something and saying it, we hope, for the sake of history. That's another way to show people, the students, that they're doing what other people have done, and that art does have those kinds of messages. I think it's hard. Cartoons in the late 18th century are, and actually the early 19th century, they're a hard thing to teach with because visually they're complicated. They're like little tiny images that are hard to make out. They're very focused on words, so there'll be like these big balloons coming out of people's mouths, and there'll be this long kind of a statement with all kinds of buzzwords in it that are not immediately clear. They'll be doing what they do sometimes in newspapers and pamphlets, which is only including the first and last letter of something because they don't want to put someone's name and get in trouble for putting the name there. So I realized that with political cartoons in the founding era and the antebellum era, sometimes it can be hard to teach with them. But that's another case in which I think the image, what's happening in the image, can get you past that, and then you can use the language and decode it as a way of commenting on whatever the image shows. And of course, you can also talk about the artist,
Mm-hmm.
and their politics, and like Trumbull is fascinating. And there is a museum catalog that is not here because it's in New Haven. But I got that statement of Trumbull saying, "I will tell the history of my country in my own language" from one of those museum catalogs. He's a great case study because he's very explicitly trying to tell the history of the United States. It's his conscious purpose. And so
Mm-hmm.
he is a useful person. You can even use the grand, iconic Trumbull images, a signing of the Declaration, and burrow beneath them. What are they really saying? What are they really showing? What are they not showing? What's not in the picture? And that's also, I think, a really powerful teaching tool because students are going to think they know that, right? Oh yeah, it's that thing with the guys and they're sitting around and some of them are standing and there's a lot of shins, guys' legs showing. It's like, okay, but what's the real message? What do you think the painter's trying to say, and what comes across? I mean, a totally goofy comment that just came into my brain and now I can't resist saying it. I think it's the image of the signing of the Declaration, Trumbull's image of the signing of the Declaration, that someone looked at it and called it a shin piece because it seemed to be just a painting of men's shins with like white stockings on them. It was like, there's way too many legs. Like, why are there all these legs? And there's a later painting that Trumbull made, and there's like a little postscript. He's writing to a friend describing it, and he says it like almost parenthetically, a lot less legs. Like, I've covered up the legs.
That's
Anyway,
fantastic.
yeah.
But that point about um, the artist their politics and why they're doing it really is an important one. And as you're talking, it made me reminded me of um, Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre and the intent behind the imagery that he was using in creating that kind of element.
And that's a
And
great example of, and you're absolutely right. That's like it's a piece of propaganda,
mhm,
but there's a way in which you could use that image and then do a version of what I do in my classes, which is I have a patriot version of that event in
mhm,
writing and a British soldiers version in writing about what happened. If you
mhm,
take those three things together, you will see three different events.
mhm.
And that would be a really interesting way also to get at the fact that how we understand history. There isn't one history, and
Right.
I hadn't actually in the past added that image, Matt, but that's a would be a really great addition.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
No, it's
Oh, and I
yeah.
will
And
say, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
10 years ago when I taught humanities, that was one of the things that I taught. So, um, um, the other comment I wanted to make was that uh, our friends at the Library of Congress have a number of teacher-friendly sort of worksheets that will give teachers sort of the language that they need to work through some of this with their students. So, um,
Particularly topics that they assume people are going to want to address. So I think that's
yes,
a good point too. The other
yeah,
thing I wanted to address before we move on to another question is just I see Emily Trumbull's papers and art studies are at Yale. I want to mention this because it's more evidence of Trumbull's intention. So the Yale Art Gallery, actually I haven't been there since it's been revamped, but I assume still on the top floor. There's a room Trumbull bequeathed a lot of his artwork to Yale. And he didn't go to Yale, but he thought that Harvard, in some ways, was wealthy enough not to need it. Yale seemed more in need. So he left his art, but he left provisions, and he said the art has to always be on the campus of Yale. It has to be used for teaching purposes. That's why it's there, is for teaching purposes. And so there's this Trumbull room that has some iconic images, some that are not iconic, but it's a great, if you're in New Haven, if you're already there, it's a great teaching opportunity because of the fact that you're surrounded with him making statements. The other provision that I wanted to mention, just because I can't resist mentioning it, is Trumbull wanted to stay with his paintings. So he's buried under them. He's buried under the art gallery.
mm-hmm.
And the art gallery shifted in location at some point in the past, and I found online notes between Yale administrators at some point in the early 20th century, I think, talking about how they were going to move the paintings and Trumbull over spring break so there'd be fewer students around to see the process. But
Wow.
yeah, Trumbull is still there. And at one point, I took students on a tour, and I actually managed to find our way down to where Trumbull was. And I remember one of the docents at the art gallery saying that they joked that they wanted one of the T-shirts that people who worked there they wanted it to say closed on Mondays and there's a dead guy in the basement. But that does, above and beyond my morbid sense of humor, that shows you how connected he was to what he was doing and what he really thought the importance of it was. So that was my Trumbull.
Phenomenal. I want that T-shirt.
Yeah, I know. I wanted that T-shirt too.
Let's shift to how we think about this today. Ryan asked a question a while ago that I think is interesting. What do you think / hope will happen to the art, signs, posters, etc.? And he asks it specifically around the fences around the White House, but I think we can ask this question more broadly, ranging, because we've talked about some of the artifacts that are left at the wall of Vietnam, or the Vietnam Memorial, to the art and posters that we see around, as you mentioned, moments of social unrest, or social tragedy, or national tragedy. So what do you think, or hope as a historian, will happen to the art, signs, posters, etc., that we see in these places?
Well, in a sense, my obvious answer is going to be save them. Save them because they're expressions of a moment in time, right? So I would say not only do those things need to be saved because they are a public form of expression, but they need to be saved in an organized manner and dated in some way, the date of collection. Because if I, as a historian, 100 years from now, if I go back to this moment and I want to understand some of public opinion or, some of what's going on in this moment, how handy would it be for me to say, oh, here's a bunch of stuff that was collected in June of 2020 that was put around the White House. Here's something that was, from 1 year before. As a historian, I would look at those things and I would try and figure out what they could tell me together and in comparison with each other. So I think saving them is hugely important because I do think, in a way, I'm trying to decide if I want to say this, but I will. In a way, it's a kind of folk art because it's a people's art, right? All of these sorts of things are people expressing their feelings at the moment and trying to send a message in the moment. So I really, really would hope that they're saved, that they're collected as a group, that they're documented, the timing of them is documented. So I haven't ever looked at it, but someone told me that at Yale, there's a collection of memorabilia from the bicentennial, and by memorabilia I mean keychains, fake Liberty Bells, all of the goofy, commercial stuff being sold, trinkets about the bicentennial. Now, I've never had a reason to use it so far, but I've always been fascinated because, kind of along the lines of what we're talking about now, if I went and looked at that, I would capture some aspect of what some people were thinking in 1976 about what the nation represented to them and what they wanted people to see. There would be strong messages being sent that we, even not that long in the future away from that, would not be aware that were being sent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just the accessibility for that kind of stuff is such an important aspect of what historians do. And I think we have time for one more quick question, and then
I will talk to people again, just to point out that all kinds of resources are spinning by there in chat. So I see someone, James Stewart, just said the Smithsonian's already talking to artists about collecting the artworks. That makes me happy.
Yes, absolutely.
Kind of.
I think my concern as somebody interested in history and history education was when I heard that protesters were taking some of those things away to preserve them.
I know. which I understand, but it's the
which you understand and you value, and it's amazing that they're being saved, and but at the same time, as like you said, saving them in the right way is what will preserve the message in sort of different, in a much more in a different capacity than that. So
although I will note, and I suppose this could be used for teaching purposes too, I think the New York Times just photographed everything on that fence around the White House,
yeah.
and you can scroll through it, and they've offered commentary on some of the items. That's gone up in the last day or two. I think I tweeted about it because I thought it was really striking. So even if we don't get those items back together, they actually have been collected, photographed as they were. And that would be a really interesting teaching tool all by itself. What are people saying? How do the things that they're saying relate to each other? What is expressed by the things together that might not be expressed with things by themselves? So yeah, I mean, you know, it's the most obvious thing in the world to say, but artwork, culture, just because it communicates on so many levels, can get at so many unspoken things about the past and present.
So I'm going to combine two questions, one from Carolyn and one from Tim.
Okay, Washington
which
Post, not New
which
York.
ask, I'm sorry, what?
I think it was the Washington Post and not the New York Times.
Yes.
That did the scrolling thing. So thank you, Orland.
Carolyn and Tim ask about some different kinds of art, and that we haven't discussed. So maybe it's worth sort of ending on that, which is Tim asks about like architecture and how that was used for particular purposes. And Carolyn asks about photography and the advent of photography and how that may have changed. So any comments you have about both or either of those topics?
Yeah, I'll be brief, but yeah, I can speak on both of them. Architecture, and I had it initially in my notes for what I was going to talk about, and then I dropped it out because I wanted to only include not more than a half hour of me talking. But yeah, architecture, certainly in early America, was very much part of that project of building a culture. Thomas Jefferson in particular, very much was in favor of studying classical works of architecture, going to Europe to see some of them, and then creating works of architecture in the United States that would, he thought, inspire people, inspire the kinds of values he thought that they needed to inspire. So architecture was very consciously part of the project of creating some kind of an American identity and communicating to Americans some of what America was. I mean, it's one of the things I love about the founding period is so much of what they're doing is so deliberate and self-conscious, and so improvised. That's just a fascinating thing to me, and that's not always the case, particularly with culture and elite people willing to analyze what they themselves are doing. But anyway, so architecture, I think, very much is part of this. Photography too, you know, in the mid-19th century, when photography, you know, daguerreotypes are beginning to come into their own, the most famous example of this, and I'm sure many of you know about this, are the battlefield photographs from the Civil War. People had never before seen the reality of battles, of warfare. I put it in quotation marks because there was some moving around of people and bodies to make a point. So everything was not photographed as it began. Despite that, the fact that Matthew Brady and others went out and took those photographs and captured some form of the reality of what was out there was bracing and shocking and horrifying and new, and had an impact that I think artworks have a different kind of an impact, but there's a smack you in the face kind of an impact with a photograph. Even though you have to think about, along the lines of what I just said, some of the bodies were moved. You have to think about what was done to take the portrait, the photograph, but even so, the power of that, you know, even on a personal level, when I moved from the 1790s in my first book and got up to the Civil War in my most recent book, and suddenly there were photographs of, for the first time ever, I'm writing about something where photographs exist. It blew my mind, right? I was just like, this is what the person really looked like, you know, or at least in some sense, you know, that's that's really John Quincy Adams, that had a power even from the distance of time for me. Portraits capture elements of people as interpreted by a painter. Photographs capture different things, but because they seem to capture a moment in time in some way, there's an added power to that. And I think we are out of time.
We are.
We are.
And we even went a little bit over.
We
So
went a little over. You guys are asking such good questions. Oh, the chat from others has disappeared. Someone says we're gonna have to figure out what to do with this chat stuff because there's so much
yeah,
stuff that comes out, and I'm not savvy enough to know how to work with it. At any rate, I do, before we lose those of you who are leaving, I invite those of you to stick around for the after party. I did not name it that. One of our wonderful people who joins us every week named it the after party. We don't record it, but we do continue the conversation. But before those of you go away who are going away, I hope you will join us next week. I am actually still deciding what I'm going to talk about. I'm very much trying to respond in some ways to the moment. And so that I'm hoping that some of the conversation that we're having here and the reflections that I'm offering are going to be useful for the moment. And then I'm trying to connect that with historical evidence of some kind that has stuck with me and reflects on the same thing. So anyway, I will figure it out, and like this week, it will be communicated in advance. But please come back and join us in our what I think is becoming a history community
really
that comes
has.
together every Thursday morning. So thanks to everybody for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
And now I see people